"Dad, we're worried you're losing your memory," my son-in-law said, his voice dripping with false concern as my daughter nodded tearfully. "It's time to let us take over the company." I saw the trap in his eyes, the ambition, and I agreed. But that night, alone in my office, I opened a secret file. He thought I was a fading old man, so I forgot to tell him about the audit I had ordered weeks ago. Justice is coming. You won't believe what happens next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The audit. It was a word that felt like a betrayal in itself. For 40 years, the foundation of Sterling construction was not just concrete and steel, but absolute, unwavering trust. It was a trust forged in the crucible of late nights, lean years, and shared dreams between myself and my late wife, Martha. She was the heart of the company, the charismatic force of nature who could win over the most stubborn city planners and inspire loyalty in the toughest construction crews. I was the architect, the strategist, the man who saw the blueprint not just as a design but as a promise. We were a perfect partnership, a symphony of vision and execution. I remember the day we laid the cornerstone for our very first skyscraper. We were standing on a muddy plot of land, a ridiculously ambitious blueprint clutched in our hands, and the banks had just threatened to pull our funding for the third time. "Are we crazy, George?" Martha had asked, a rare flicker of doubt in her eyes. I had taken her hand, calloused and strong, and placed it on the cold stone. "History is written by crazy people, my love," I told her. "The ones who see a skyline where others see only mud. We build this, and we build our legacy." And we did. We built a legacy of integrity, of quality, of promises kept. David entered our lives when that legacy was already firmly established. He was a young, ambitious MBA graduate who was dating our daughter, Sarah. He was charming, intelligent, and he said all the right things. He spoke reverently of our company's history, of the legend of George and Martha Sterling. He seemed to understand our values. Martha, always the better judge of character, had a quiet reservation. "He's almost too polished, George," she'd said to me one evening after a family dinner. "What do you mean, honey?" I asked, watching David, on the patio making our daughter laugh. "His ambition, it's not the same as ours," she mused. "We wanted to build things. I feel like he just wants to own things. There's a difference." As always, she was right. But Sarah was deeply in love, and I, wanting only my daughter's happiness, welcomed him into the company and into the family. For years, he was the model son-in-law, the perfect COO. He was deferential to me, attentive to Sarah, and he worked tirelessly. He learned every facet of the business, from contract negotiation to supply chain management. I saw him as our successor, the man who would carry the Sterling name into the future. I didn't see that he was not learning to carry a legacy, but merely studying the weight of a crown he intended to steal. The change began after Martha passed away. The light of my life, the heart of our company, was gone. Grief is a heavy fog. It clouds judgment and slows the mind. And in that fog, David began his insidious work. It wasn't a sudden coup. It was a slow, methodical campaign of psychological erosion, a technique I would later learn was called gaslighting. It started with small, almost unnoticeable things. A file I was certain I had left on my desk would turn up in the archives. "Don't worry, George," David would say with a concerned smile. "We all misplace things. I'll have my assistant organize your desk for you." An important meeting, one I had been preparing for all week, would be rescheduled at the last minute. "I sent you an email, Dad," Sarah would say, her face a mask of worried sympathy. "David and I were talking. We thought it was best to lighten your load. You've been under so much stress." They spoke in the language of care, but their actions were the cold, calculated moves of a corporate takeover. He began to isolate me. He would hold pre-meetings with key executives before the official board meetings, setting the agenda and shaping the narrative before I even entered the room. When I would question a decision, he would respond with a patient, condescending tone. George, we actually discussed this last week, remember? Perhaps it slipped your mind. He would say it in front of others, in front of Sarah, planting the seed of my supposed decline. He started using my love for my daughter as his primary weapon. He would go to her, his voice filled with feigned concern. "Sarah, I'm worried about your father," I once overheard him saying to her in the hallway. He seemed so confused in the planning meeting today. He kept referencing the old downtown project we finished 5 years ago. I had to gently correct him in front of the entire team. It was embarrassing for him. It was a complete fabrication. I had been using the old project as a successful case study, a historical precedent. But in his retelling, my strategic analysis became the rambling of a senile old man. And Sarah, who loved me and trusted her husband, believed him. Her eyes started to fill with a painful mixture of pity and sorrow whenever she looked at me. She began to treat me not as her father, the titan who had built her world, but as a fragile relic to be protected and eventually managed. The first time I knew with absolute certainty that this was a deliberate attack was when we lost the Henderson Tower contract. It was a legacy project, the biggest in the city's history, a project I had been pursuing for years. We were the front runners. Our proposal was flawless. Then, at the last minute, we were underbid by our biggest competitor by a margin so slim it was almost impossible. It was as if they had seen our final numbers. I tore the office apart looking for a leak, a mole, an explanation. David was the picture of commiseration. "We'll get the next one, George," he said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Don't stress yourself out over this. It's not good for your health." That night, unable to sleep, I went back to the office. Using an old administrative access code I had never relinquished, I began to dig through the server logs, and there it was. An encrypted file sent from David's executive email account to an anonymous external address, just hours before the final bid was submitted. The file was our entire Henderson Tower proposal. He hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had committed treason. He had deliberately sabotaged the company, our company, Martha's company, to create the illusion of my failure. I sat there in the pre-dawn stillness of my office, the glow of the monitor illuminating, the digital proof of David's treachery. The initial shock gave way to a white-hot rage, so intense it made my hands tremble. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to storm into his office, to throw the evidence in his face, to expose him for the snake he was in front of the entire company, in front of my daughter. But then, as the first rays of dawn crept over the city skyline we had helped build, another voice, a calmer, more familiar one, echoed in my mind. It was Martha's voice, from that last lucid conversation. "Be careful with David, George. He has ambition, but no heart. And take care of Sarah. She loves him. She will not see the truth." She was right. A direct confrontation would be a messy public war. David, with his smooth words and carefully cultivated image, would twist the narrative. He would paint me as a vengeful, paranoid old man, lashing out in my grief. He would use Sarah as a shield, forcing her to choose between her father and her husband, a choice that would shatter her. I would win the battle, perhaps, but I would lose my daughter in the process. No, Martha wouldn't have wanted that. A war of attrition, a public spectacle, was his style. It was not mine. My style, the style that had won us countless impossible contracts, was the art of the long game. It was about understanding the psychology of your opponent, about letting their own arrogance become their downfall. David thought his greatest weapon was his ability to manipulate. He was about to learn that I was a far better student of that dark art than he could ever hope to be. He had given me a script, that of a confused, fading old man. I decided in that moment that I would give the performance of a lifetime. My counteroffensive began not with a bang, but with a whisper. The next morning, I called a meeting with David and Sarah. I didn't mention the Henderson contract. Instead, I played my part. I looked tired, defeated. "You were right, David," I began, my voice deliberately frail. "Losing the Henderson deal. It's a young man's game now. I don't think I have the fight in me anymore. My memory, it's not what it used to be." I saw a flicker of triumphant relief in David's eyes, quickly masked by a performance of deep, loving concern. "Oh, Dad, don't say that," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're a legend. You just need a rest. Sarah and I can handle things from here. We'll take care of you. We'll protect your legacy." "I know you will," I said, meeting his gaze. "I trust you. I trust you both." It was the most difficult lie I had ever told, and so the game began. I started to forget things. I would misplace my keys only to have David's assistant find them for me. I would ask the same question twice in a meeting, allowing David to gently remind me that we had already covered that topic. I would show up at the office at odd hours, looking slightly disoriented, mumbling about old projects. Each small act was a carefully placed brick in the wall of my supposed incompetence. A wall that was being built not to imprison me, but to lull my enemy into a false and fatal sense of security. Sarah, my poor, dear Sarah, was an unwitting pawn in this cruel chess match. Her concern for me was genuine, her heart breaking a little more with each one of my lapses. "Dad, maybe you should see a doctor," she would plead, her eyes welling with tears. "We can get you the best care." "I'm just tired, sweetheart," I would reassure her, the guilt of my deception a bitter pill to swallow. Just getting old. While my days were a performance of frailty, my nights were a silent, relentless investigation. I was no longer a CEO. I was a forensic accountant, a spy in my own company. With the help of my old trusted friend, a retired IT security expert, I set up a mirrored server. Every file David accessed, every email he sent, every keystroke he made was secretly copied and delivered to a secure laptop I kept hidden in my home study. The picture that emerged was more rotten than I could have imagined. David wasn't just sabotaging deals. He was systematically bleeding the company dry. There were phantom suppliers, shell corporations registered in his friends' names, billing us for materials that were never delivered. There were inflated invoices, consulting fees paid to his cronies for non-existent work. He was building a secret empire of debt and fraud, all while planning to pin the inevitable collapse on my failing leadership. He was not just trying to steal a company, he was trying to erase a legacy. He was taking the name Sterling, a name Martha and I had built into a symbol of integrity, and he was dragging it through the mud to line his own pockets. The more evidence I gathered, the colder and more resolute I became. My act grew more convincing. I allowed David to take over more and more of my responsibilities, publicly praising his sharp mind and steady hand in board meetings. He and his allies, the executives he had promoted, would exchange smug, knowing glances. The old lion was finally retreating, leaving the kingdom to the jackals. But it was during this time that I began my most important work. I knew exposing the fraud was only half the battle. I needed to protect Sarah, and I needed to protect the company itself from the fallout. I quietly reached out to Frank Miller, our firm's oldest and most loyal legal counsel, a man who had been with Martha and me from the very beginning. I met him not at the office, but at a quiet corner table in an old diner, much like the one where my own story had started. I laid out the files, the server logs, the proof of David's betrayal. Frank's face, usually so placid and controlled, grew darker with each page he turned. "I knew something was wrong, George," he said, his voice a low growl. "But this is a betrayal on an epic scale. What do you want to do?" "I want to save my daughter," I said, "and I want to save my company, in that order. And to do that, Frank, I need to set a stage. I need a final act, and I need a very, very thorough audit." The audit was the easy part. Frank Miller, our lawyer, initiated it under the guise of a routine 5-year financial review, a standard corporate practice that David, in his arrogance, couldn't reasonably object to without raising suspicion. To further allay his fears, we agreed to use a firm that David himself had recommended in the past, a firm he believed was friendly. He had no idea that I had already had a discreet, off-the-record meeting with the senior partner, an old acquaintance of mine, and had shown him just enough evidence to ensure his team would be looking in all the right places. The fuse was lit. It was now a matter of timing the explosion. The harder part, the part that required the delicate touch of a surgeon rather than the hammer of a CEO, was saving Sarah. I couldn't simply show her the evidence. David had spent years weaving a web of manipulation around her, isolating her loyalty. A direct accusation from me would be seen as the paranoid ramblings of a fading mind. She would retreat further into his camp, and I would lose her forever. No, I had to let her find the truth herself. I had to plant the seeds of doubt and give them the space to grow in the fertile ground of her own intelligence. My performance of forgetfulness became my greatest tool. It allowed me to ask questions and raise issues that would seem suspicious coming from a sharp-minded CEO, but were perfectly plausible coming from a confused old man. I began during one of our quiet weekend dinners, a ritual David had insisted on to maintain the illusion of a happy, caring family. "Sarah, sweetheart," I began, looking up from my plate with a practiced air of befuddlement. "Something has been bothering me. I was looking over some old files today, the blueprints for the children's hospital wing. I can't for the life of me remember signing off on the steel supplier, Apex Global. Do you recall that?" Sarah looked at David, who gave a reassuring smile. "It's all right, Dad," he said smoothly. "We handled that. Apex gave us a fantastic price. It was a great deal." "Was it?" I asked, my voice filled with a childlike innocence. "That's funny. I seem to recall your mother, Martha. She put that company on an internal blacklist years ago. Something about, what was it? Substandard materials and connections to organized crime. But my memory is so foggy these days. I'm probably mistaken." I said no more. I let the comment hang in the air and then changed the subject, talking about the weather. But I saw the seed had been planted. I saw the faint, troubled frown on Sarah's face. She knew her mother's judgment was impeccable. For the first time, a hairline crack appeared in the perfect facade of her husband's authority. A week later, I tried again. I accidentally left a folder on the coffee table, one containing the preliminary budget for a new community center we were building. Later that evening, I called her in a panic. "Sarah, my dear, I've done something silly," I said, my voice shaky. "I seem to have misplaced the community center budget file. David needs it for his presentation tomorrow, and I just can't find it. My mind is like a sieve." "It's okay, Dad. Calm down," she said, her voice full of the gentle patience she now always used with me. "It's right here on the coffee table. You left it here after lunch." "Oh, thank heavens," I sighed. "Could you do your old man a favor? Just open it and read me the final figure for the landscaping contract. I need to make sure it matches my notes." She obliged. I heard her rustling papers. "It says $500,000, Dad." "500?" I asked, feigning confusion. "That can't be right. That's twice what our usual firm quoted. Who is the contractor?" "It says Viridian Landscapes." "Viridian?" I repeated. "Never heard of them. Are you sure? The name of the CEO isn't Julian Croft, is it?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Julian Croft was David's old college roommate, a man whose previous business ventures had all ended in spectacular failure. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice now barely a whisper. "It is." "Ah," I said, letting out a long, weary sigh. "Well, David must know what he's doing. He's the expert now. Thank you, sweetheart. You've been a great help." I hung up, leaving her alone. with the silence and the sickening realization that her husband had just awarded a $500,000 contract to his incompetent best friend, using her confused father's company as a piggy bank. The cracks were widening. The final piece I needed was to show her the human cost of David's ambition, the cost to the legacy her mother had built. I knew that Sarah, despite everything, had her mother's heart. I invited her to lunch, not at a fancy restaurant, but at a small, unassuming diner near one of our oldest construction sites. As we were eating, an older man in a worn work coat approached our table, his hat in his hands. It was Mike, our company's first ever foreman, a man who had worked with my wife and me for over 40 years. "Mr. Sterling, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I heard you were retiring. I just wanted to thank you for everything. You and Mrs. Sterling, you gave me a chance when no one else would. You put my kids through college. This company, it's been my life." I stood up and shook his hand, my own eyes misty. "The company was built by good men like you, Mike. It was an honor to work with you." As he walked away, I looked at Sarah. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "He is," I agreed. "They laid him off last week." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Why?" "David's orders," I said with a simple shrug. "Restructuring, cutting costs. He's being replaced by a new team from one of David's partner firms. They're cheaper, apparently." I didn't need to say another word. She understood. David wasn't just stealing money. He was tearing out the very soul of the company, discarding the loyal men and women who were its foundation, replacing them with nameless, faceless cogs in his machine of greed. That was the turning point for her. She went home that day a different woman. The loving, trusting wife had been replaced by a daughter with a dawning, terrible suspicion. My performance was no longer needed. The seeds I had planted had taken root, and now it was time for the audit to bring the harvest. For my daughter, Sarah, the days that followed were a quiet, personal hell. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, caught between the two men who had defined her life. The father she adored but believed was fading, and the husband she loved but was beginning to suspect. Every loving word from David now seemed to have a double meaning. Every concerned glance at my health felt like a strategic move in a game she didn't understand. The beautiful, stable home she had built with him suddenly felt like a house of cards, trembling on the verge of collapse. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She was her mother's daughter, after all, cautious, intelligent. And she was her father's daughter, too, methodical. She needed more than suspicion. She needed proof. She needed to know for her own sanity if her fears were the product of a terrible truth, or if she was simply succumbing to the paranoia of her father's supposed decline. So she began her own quiet investigation, a secret rebellion conducted in the heart of her own home. She became a historian of her own life, sifting through the artifacts of her marriage, looking for the truth she had been blind to for so long. Her investigation started with the landscaping contract, the one for Viridian Landscapes, owned by David's friend, Julian Croft. She told David she was helping me organize my old files to keep my mind active, a lie that he readily accepted, even patting her on the back for being such a good daughter. With this excuse, she gained access to the company's digital archives. Late at night, after David was asleep, she would sit in the glow of her laptop, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She pulled up the Viridian contract. The $500,000 figure glared back at her. Then she did what David, in his arrogance, never thought she would do. She started to cross-reference. She pulled up the invoices from our longtime trusted landscaping firm, The One. Mike, our old foreman, had recommended years ago. Their quote for the same community center project, submitted just a month before they were dismissed, was for $220,000. Less than half. The discrepancy was so blatant, so insulting, it took her breath away. This wasn't just a bad business decision. It was theft, pure and simple, disguised as a contract. She kept digging. She looked into Viridian Landscapes itself. The company had been registered just 3 days before the contract was awarded. It had no history, no portfolio, no other clients. Its registered address was a P.O. box. It was a shell, a ghost created for the sole purpose of funneling $500,000 of her family's money into the pockets of her husband's friend. That discovery was the first real crack in her world. The love and trust she had for David, a foundation she had thought was solid granite, suddenly felt like fragile glass. But she needed more. She had to be certain. Her next step was to look at the Henderson Tower project, the one that had supposedly broken my spirit. She remembered David's story vividly, my confusion, my outdated methods, my inability to compete. She pulled up the final proposal, the one I had supposedly bungled. It was, as I had known, a masterpiece. The design was innovative, the financials were sound, the logistics were flawless. It was the work of a man at the peak of his powers, not a man in decline. Then she found what she was looking for. Tucked away in a digital outbox, an email sent from David's account in the dead of night just before the bid was lost. The recipient was an executive at the rival firm. The subject line was innocuous, regarding our lunch meeting, but the attachment was a single devastating file, a password-protected document containing our final, confidential bid numbers. The password was legacy. The sheer, cynical cruelty of it brought tears to her eyes. He hadn't just stolen from the company. He had stolen from me. He had sabotaged my work and then used that sabotage as proof of my incompetence, all while comforting me with his treacherous, sympathetic lies. He had weaponized my life's work against me. The image of her father, the titan who had built skylines, now reduced to a confused old man asking her about misplaced files, flashed in her mind. But the image was different now. She didn't see weakness. She saw a performance. She saw the forgotten names of suppliers, the misplaced budget files, the confused questions. They weren't lapses in memory. They were clues. They were breadcrumbs her father, the brilliant strategist, had been leaving for her, trusting in her intelligence to follow them to the truth. He wasn't fading. He was fighting, and he was trying to save her without destroying her world. The weight of this realization was crushing. She had been a pawn, a willing accomplice in the character assassination of her own father. Her loving concern had been the very tool David had used to isolate and undermine him. The guilt was a physical pain, a sickness in the pit of her stomach. She knew she had to act. She had to choose a side. Sarah did not confront David. The historian's daughter knew that a premature declaration of war against a superiorly entrenched enemy was a recipe for disaster. David still held all the power within the company. He had his loyalists in key positions. He controlled the flow of information. If she revealed her hand now, he would simply discredit her, paint her as an emotional, hysterical woman swayed by her senile father. He would isolate her, just as he had isolated me. No, she would not give him that satisfaction. She would follow her father's lead. She would continue to play her part. But now, her performance would have a new, secret purpose. She would become her father's spy, his inside agent in the heart of the enemy camp. Her transformation was subtle, almost invisible. To David, she remained the loving, concerned wife. She continued to express her worries about my health. She continued to manage my schedule. She continued to be his perfect alibi. But now her every action was a carefully calculated move. She became a master of feigned innocence. "David, honey," she would say, her voice a perfect imitation of a confused wife trying to understand her husband's complex world. I was looking at the quarterly reports and I saw the payment to Apex Global. I'm so glad you found a supplier who could give us a better deal. Dad was so worried about it. How did you manage to get them to lower their prices so much? She would watch him, forcing him to spin a web of lies to cover his initial fraud, a web that she was now silently, meticulously documenting. She used her access to his office, not as a wife, but as an intelligence operative. While he was in meetings, she would take photographs of documents on his desk with her phone. She forwarded suspicious emails from his computer to a secret, encrypted account she had created. She became a silent collector of the very evidence that would eventually seal his fate. This quiet war of deception took its toll. She was living a double life, torn between the man she had once loved and the father she was now fighting to protect. The stress was immense, but it was forged into a steely resolve by the memory of her mother's wisdom and the quiet strength she now saw in her father. Meanwhile, the audit was proceeding, a silent, ticking clock in the background. David, initially unconcerned, began to grow nervous. The auditors, guided by the anonymous tips I was feeding their senior partner through my lawyer, Frank Miller, were asking questions that were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. They were pulling records he thought were long buried, questioning contracts he thought were ironclad. He began to sense that his timeline was shrinking, that the walls were slowly closing in. His charm began to fray at the edges, replaced by a tense, irritable paranoia. He started working late, shredding documents, having hushed, angry phone calls behind closed doors. He knew the game was nearing its end, and he decided he had to make one final, decisive move to seize control before the audit could expose him. The point of no return came on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the day of our company's annual foundation dinner, a charity event that had been Martha's passion project. It was a night to celebrate our company's commitment to the community. David decided to use it as his stage. He came to me in my study a few hours before the event, Sarah at his side. He was holding a sheaf of legal documents, and his face was a mask of grave, sorrowful determination. "Dad," he began, his voice heavy with feigned regret. "Sarah and I have been talking, and we've made a difficult decision. We love you, but we can no longer stand by and watch you struggle, and we cannot allow the company, Mom's legacy, to be put at risk." He placed the documents on my desk. They were legal papers for an immediate and total transfer of power. He was using a clause in the corporate bylaws, a clause intended for a medical emergency, to strip me of my titles and my authority, effective immediately. The papers cited my increasingly erratic behavior and cognitive decline as the reasons. It was a corporate coup, disguised as an act of mercy. "We need you to sign these, Dad," he said, his voice soft. "It's for the best. It's what Mom would have wanted." That was his mistake. Invoking Martha's name, using her memory to justify his treachery. That was a line he should never have crossed. I looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. She knew what this was. She had tried to warn me, slipping me a note just an hour before, but David had been with her constantly. This was his final, all-or-nothing gambit. I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. David's face was a study in tense, triumphant expectation. He thought he had won. He thought his long campaign of manipulation had finally reached its conclusion. And then I began to play my final card. "You're right, David," I said, my voice deliberately shaky, my hand trembling as I held the pen. "My memory, it's so bad. I don't think I can sign this. Not without understanding it fully." I looked at Sarah. "Sweetheart," I said, "your old father is so confused. Before I sign away your mother's company, could you just explain this one clause to me? The one about the fiduciary duty of the CEO?" It was a checkmate move, and only Sarah understood it. The fiduciary duty clause was the very heart of corporate law. the sacred responsibility of a leader to act in the company's best interest. It was the very duty that David had violated with every secret deal, every shell company, every act of fraud. By asking Sarah to explain it in front of him, I was forcing her to choose. She could either participate in the final lie, or she could, finally, publicly stand with the truth. The silence in my study was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The only sound was the frantic, silent scream of my daughter's inner turmoil, a battle so profound I could almost see it raging behind her eyes. David stared at her, his confident smile frozen on his face, a silent command in his gaze, urging her to play along, to dismiss my question as another sign of my dotage. He didn't understand the question I had truly asked. I wasn't asking for a legal definition. I was asking her, "Whose side are you on?" For what felt like an eternity, she stood motionless, a statue carved from grief and indecision. I could see the years of love for her husband warring with the lifetime of trust she had for her father. I could see her mother's strength, her mother's integrity, rising from some deep, forgotten place within her. She finally turned, not to me, but to David. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a worried daughter or a compliant wife. It was the voice of a sterling. It was the voice of her mother. "Fiduciary duty, David," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound, steely clarity, "means putting the company's interests above your own. It means you don't award $500,000 contracts to your unqualified friends. It means you don't create shell companies to bill for services that were never rendered. And it means you certainly don't sabotage a legacy project and then blame it on a good man's grief." The color drained from David's face. The charming mask disintegrated, revealing the panicked, cornered creature beneath. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" he stammered, his eyes darting between us. "Your father has been filling your head with nonsense. He's confused." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head slowly. "I'm not confused anymore. For the first time in years, I see everything perfectly." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not pity, but a profound, heartbreaking apology. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." That was the moment David's world truly ended. He hadn't just lost the company. He had lost his greatest shield, his most powerful weapon, my daughter's love. "You!" he snarled at her, his voice a venomous hiss. "You will regret this." He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving the unsigned documents scattered on my desk like the wreckage of his failed coup. Sarah collapsed into a chair, the adrenaline leaving her, replaced by a wave of gut-wrenching sobs. I went to her, not as a victorious strategist, but as a father. I held her as she cried for her lost love, for her own blindness, for the terrible choice she had been forced to make. There were no "I told you so's." There was only the quiet, shared grief of two people who had been betrayed by someone they both had loved. "What do we do now, Dad?" she whispered, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "Now," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "we finish what your mother started. We protect her legacy." The foundation dinner that evening was supposed to be David's coronation. It became, instead, his funeral. He didn't show up. Sarah and I attended together. She stood at my side, a silent, powerful statement of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the company's key stakeholders and employees. I did not need to say a word. Her presence next to me was the only speech that mattered. The next morning, Frank Miller, our lawyer, formally served David with a notice. He was suspended from his duties as COO, pending the results of the now expedited internal audit. His access to the company was revoked. He was locked out. The jackals had been chased from the kingdom, and now it was time to assess the damage. The final report from the auditors arrived 3 days later. It was a thick, damning document, a detailed autopsy of David's greed. It was worse than I had thought. The fraud was not just a few million, it was systemic, running into the tens of millions. He had been preparing to gut the company, sell off its most valuable assets to his cronies, and leave nothing but a hollowed-out shell, all while framing me for the collapse. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Frank called a final mandatory meeting of the board of directors. David was legally required to attend. It was not to be a negotiation. It was to be a reckoning. Sarah and I walked into that boardroom together. She was nervous but resolute. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your mother is with us today," I whispered. "This is her final board meeting." David was already there, sitting at the head of the table, a place he had usurped from me. He looked haggard, cornered, but his eyes still burned with a defiant arrogance. He thought this was his last stand, a final chance to talk his way out of trouble. He didn't know that his fate had already been sealed. I did not take a seat at the table. Instead, I walked to the front of the room, to the projector screen where so many battles had been fought and won. I was not there as a grieving father or a confused old man. I was George Sterling, the founder, the builder, the man whose name was on the wall, and it was time to deliver the final audit of my own. The boardroom was a theater of ghosts. I could feel Martha's presence in the room, her portrait watching over us from the far wall, her gaze a silent, judging presence. The faces around the long, polished table were a mixture of old allies and new appointments, David's men. They sat with tense, uncomfortable expressions, caught in a power struggle they were only just beginning to understand. David, sitting at the head of the table, in my chair, tried to seize control from the outset. He began before our lawyer, Frank, could even call the meeting to order. His voice was a strained imitation of his usual smooth charm, a desperate attempt to frame the narrative one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I know there have been rumors, and I understand the auditors have raised some questions. This is all a regrettable misunderstanding, a result of my father-in-law's delicate state. He has been under immense strain, and his interpretation of certain standard business practices has become, shall we say, clouded. He was trying to play his last card, the confused old man gambit. He was attempting to discredit the audit before it was even presented, to paint it as the product of my senile paranoia. I did not interrupt him. I let him speak. I let him dig his own grave a little deeper. He spoke of aggressive accounting strategies and necessary corporate restructuring, wrapping his crimes in the sterile, impenetrable jargon of the business world. He was a masterful performer. I had to give him that. When he finished, a tense silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to me. They expected a shouting match, an emotional outburst, a confirmation of the very instability David had just described. I did not give them one. Instead, I gave a slight nod to Frank Miller. Frank stood up, his face grim. "Thank you for that performance, David," he said, his voice dripping with ice. "Now, let's proceed with the facts. As per the bylaws, this meeting has been called to present the findings of the mandatory 5-year audit. The full 200-page report has been delivered to each of your tablets. However, for the sake of clarity, Mr. Sterling has prepared a brief summary." I walked to the front of the room to the large presentation screen. I held a small remote in my hand. I looked at David, my expression calm, neutral. It was the same look I had given to hundreds of contractors and competitors over the years, a look that said, "The time for talk is over. Now we look at the numbers." "Good morning," I said, my voice clear and steady, devoid of emotion. For 40 years, Sterling Construction has operated on a simple principle: integrity. Our name on a building was a promise. Today, we are here to discuss the breaking of that promise. The first slide appeared on the screen. It was not a complex chart. It was a simple photograph of the invoice from Viridian Landscapes for $500,000. Next to it was the original competing bid from our trusted longtime partner, $220,000. This is not aggressive accounting, I said, my voice a quiet, damning statement of fact. This is theft. I then clicked to the next slide. It was the corporate registration for Viridian Landscapes, date of incorporation, 3 days before the contract was awarded. Registered address, a P.O. box, and the name of the sole director, Julian Croft, David's college roommate. A wave of murmurs went through the room. The board members, even David's allies, began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The abstract concept of mismanagement had just been given a name and a face. But perhaps, I continued, my tone even, this was just a single lapse in judgment. Let us examine another project. The next slide appeared. The Apex Global Steel contract. I didn't present my own suspicions. I presented the facts. I showed the internal memo from my late wife, Martha, from 10 years prior, officially blacklisting the company due to safety violations and questionable business practices. And then I showed David's signature on a contract that not only ignored that directive, but awarded Apex a non-compete deal at a price 20% above the market rate. My wife, I said, my voice catching for just a moment, a calculated display of emotion, was the most brilliant judge of character I have ever known. Her judgment was one of this company's greatest assets, a legacy my son-in-law saw fit to disregard for a commission. I clicked again. The next slide was a bank statement, a transfer of $200,000 from a shell corporation owned by Apex Global to a private offshore account, an account registered in David's name. The room was now completely silent. The air was thick with the stench of unveiled corruption. David's face was ashen. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, but David wasn't listening. He was staring at the screen, at the irrefutable digital proof of his betrayal, as if seeing a ghost. These, ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice low but carrying, to every corner of the room, are not the actions of a leader protecting a legacy. These are the actions of a predator, consuming it from the inside out. I looked directly at David. You accused me of having a faulty memory, David, but I find my memory to be perfectly clear. I remember every promise Martha and I made to each other. I remember the names of every employee we hired, and I remember every single dollar you have stolen from this family. David finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate rasp. This is a fabrication. A misunderstanding of complex financial instruments. He's twisting the data. He's a confused old man trying to settle a personal score. A personal score? I repeated, my voice still dangerously quiet. You are right about one thing, David. It did become personal. It became personal when you decided to sabotage the Henderson Tower project. I clicked the remote. The final slide appeared on the screen. It was deceptively simple. 2 columns of data. On the left, a time-stamped log of internal server access. On the right, a log of outgoing emails. My finger, steady and sure, traced a line on the screen with the laser pointer. At 2:17 a.m. on the night before the Henderson bid was due, I began, my voice the calm, clear tone of a teacher explaining a historical event. Our final, confidential bid proposal was accessed from an executive terminal, my son-in-law's terminal. 1 minute later, at 2:18 a.m., an encrypted file was sent from that same terminal to an external untraceable email address, an address that, with a little help from some very talented friends in cybersecurity, we have now traced to a holding company owned by our chief competitor. I paused, letting the full weight of the accusation settle. This was no longer just about greed. It was about corporate espionage. It was treason. And David, I said, turning to face him fully, in case you were wondering about the password you chose for that encrypted file, legacy, I must say it was a particularly tasteless choice. That was the moment he broke. The carefully constructed facade of the charming, in-control executive shattered into a million pieces. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Lies!" he screamed, his voice a raw, primal sound of pure desperation. "He's a senile old man. He's faked all of this. He's been plotting against me for years. Sarah, tell them. Tell them how confused he's been. Tell them he's not fit to run this company." All eyes in the room swiveled to my daughter. She sat at the table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. This was her final test, her moment to choose between the comfortable lies of her husband and the hard, painful truth of her father. She stood up slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. She did not look at David. She looked at me. And in her eyes I saw not the confused, manipulated girl of the past weeks, but the strong, intelligent woman Martha and I had raised. "My father," she said, her voice clear and ringing with an authority that silenced the room, "is the sanest, sharpest, and most honorable man I have ever known. The only confusion present in this family has been my own. I was blind, and I was weak. And I allowed this man." She turned, her gaze finally falling upon David with a look of cold, hard judgment, "to use my love for my father as a weapon against him. The only person unfit to be in this room, the only person unfit to carry the sterling name, is you, David. It was a public execution, delivered not by a father, but by a daughter who had finally found her voice." David stared at her, his mouth agape, utterly defeated. He had lost his last shield. I nodded to Frank Miller. "Frank, if you would." Frank stood up, his face a grim mask of legal finality. "As per the authority granted by the majority stakeholder," he began, his gaze sweeping across the stunned board members, "the board has voted to immediately terminate the employment of David for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Furthermore, the complete findings of this audit, including evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage, will be turned over to the district attorney's office this afternoon. Security will now escort you from the premises." Two uniformed security guards who had been waiting discreetly outside entered the room. They moved towards David, who seemed to shrink before our very eyes, the power and arrogance draining away from him, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man. He didn't resist. As they led him towards the door, he looked at me one last time, his eyes filled not with rage, but with a look of utter, pathetic disbelief, the look of a man who could not comprehend how the world he had so carefully built had been so completely and systematically dismantled. "How?" he whispered, the question barely audible. I did not answer him with words. I simply tapped my temple with my index finger. My memory, the very thing he had tried to turn into my weakness, had been my greatest weapon all along. As the door closed behind him, a profound silence settled over the boardroom. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised. The war was over. I looked at Sarah, who was now weeping silent tears, not of sorrow, but of release. I walked to her and put my arm around her shoulder. "It's over, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's all over." "He threw it all away, Dad," she whispered. "For nothing." "No," I replied, looking up at the portrait of Martha, her painted eyes smiling down at us. "Not for nothing. He taught us a valuable lesson. He reminded us what's truly worth fighting for." In the aftermath of that final devastating board meeting, a quiet, almost sacred calm settled over Sterling Construction. The chaos David had sown was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The news of his arrest for corporate fraud was a brief sensational story in the financial papers, a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. He took a plea deal, his grand ambitions reduced to a few years in a low-security prison and a lifetime of restitution payments. He became a ghost, a historical footnote in the company's long and storied history. Our company, however, did not crumble. It was wounded, certainly, but its foundations, the ones Martha and I had laid with decades of integrity and hard work, were strong. The jackals had been chased out, and the loyalists, the good men and women like Mike, our old foreman, whom David had cast aside, were brought back. They returned not just as employees, but as partners in a mission of restoration. The most important restoration, however, was not of a company, but of a family. The days following the boardroom confrontation were difficult for Sarah. She was forced to confront the painful truth that the man she had loved and built a life with was a stranger, a predator who had used her as a tool. There was grief, anger, and a profound sense of shame for her own blindness. But through it all, she was not alone. We talked for hours, sitting in the quiet of my study, not as a father and a daughter, but as two survivors. I did not say, "I told you so." I simply listened. I let her pour out her guilt, her anger, her confusion, and in that shared vulnerability, the wall that David had so carefully built between us for years finally crumbled into dust. We found each other again. I did not want to return to the day-to-day running of the company. My time as a CEO was over. My final battle had been fought and won. The company needed new leadership, not a ghost from the past. It needed a leader with a vision for the future, but with a deep, abiding respect for the values of its past. It needed a leader with a builder's mind and, more importantly, a builder's heart. It needed Sarah. When I proposed it to her, she was terrified. "Dad, I can't," she said, her voice filled with self-doubt. "Look at the mistakes I've made. I trusted him. I failed you." I took her hands in mine. "You didn't fail, Sarah," I told her, my voice firm. "You learned. You learned the hardest lesson there is. That trust without scrutiny is a liability. Your heart, your empathy, those are not weaknesses. They are your greatest strengths as long as they are guided by your mother's sharp mind." She had both, and so do you. The company doesn't need another ruthless strategist. It needs a leader with a conscience. It needs its soul back, and that soul is you. She accepted. And in the year that followed, I watched with a profound sense of pride as she blossomed into the leader I always knew she could be. She led not with the arrogance of her husband, but with the quiet, determined grace of her mother. She honored the old guard, she nurtured new talent, and she made Sterling Construction not just a profitable company, but a respected one once again. She was no longer just my daughter. She was her mother's legacy, brought to life. As for me, I found a new purpose. I did not retire to a life of quiet solitude. I became the chairman of the board, a mentor, a guide, the keeper of our company's history. I established the Martha Sterling Foundation, using a portion of the company's profits to fund vocational training and scholarships for young people entering the construction trades, ensuring that the dignity of honest labor would be passed down to a new generation. One afternoon, about a year after that fateful meeting, Sarah and I were walking through the construction site of the new community center, the very project David had used to defraud us. Under Sarah's leadership, it was being built not with substandard materials from a shell company, but with the finest steel and the most dedicated craftsmen. "She would have loved this," Sarah said quietly, looking up at the rising framework against the blue sky. "She would have," I agreed, a peaceful smile on my face. She always believed that the best thing you can build is something that serves others. We stood there for a long moment, a father and a daughter, partners, survivors. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. My memory was perfectly clear. I remembered the pain, the betrayal, the fight. But the memory that shone brightest was not of the battle, but of the peace that came after. I had learned that sometimes you have to feign forgetfulness to remember what truly matters, and that the greatest legacy you can leave is not a company, but a child who understands the difference between the price of things and their value. If this story of strategy, integrity, and the healing of a family has moved you, please show your support by liking and sharing this video, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where wisdom and justice prevail. Thank you for watching.